Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the 487th Imagine Buffalo program, hosted by the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. We are so glad you've joined us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Before we get started here, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video is turned off. If you have a question or a comment, you can type it into the chat box and we will go through them at the end of the presentation. We are recording this program, so you can watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channels, and you can share the link with others. Now on to our featured speaker, Alan Oberst. Alan Oberst is a prolific writer, a relentless researcher, and an innovative urban visionary with over 3 decades of experience in planning and community development. Today, he will be taking us along an intricate path of the changing development, morphology, and ecology of Scajaquada Creek. Alan, take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. I've known Dennis for a long time, so I can imagine, what Dennis might have said by way of introduction. Dennis has had several speakers in the series in recent months to talk about remaking the Scajaquada corridor, which is one of the big planning issues that's currently going on in Buffalo, and I'm one of the speakers in that series. So currently, you probably know that the Scajaquada corridor, or also known as the 198, is being replanned in a process called Region Central. The Region Central process is being overseen by GBNRTC, Greater Buffalo Niagara Regional Transportation Council, and they are our region's transportation planners. So they are overseeing the planning process, and you may have seen that last month they released a preferred scenario. So that's the context of my presentation. So let's get going. You may also recall that when the DOT was overseeing the planning for the 198, things weren't going so well, and many people felt that the DOT was not doing a good job planning. They weren't taking enough factors into account. They didn't have a broad enough scope. They weren't being respectful to the Olmstedian legacy, and they weren't listening to people. So I decided 5 years ago to get started on a series for Buffalo Rising, looking at the Scajaquada corridor and asking what would the Scajaquada corridor plans look like if we did the kind of planning that people were asking for. So that was the genesis for this work, and let me give you a look at it. So the Region Central process is looking at the 198 corridor, and as you can see from historic maps, most of the 198 corridor was originally Olmsted landscape. In fact, there was a westward extension of Delaware Park that went all the way over to Grant Street that today few people know about. One of the things I discovered in my work was just how many parallels there are between the Scajaquada corridor in Region Central and the Emerald Necklace in Boston, which is one of Olmsted's most famous landscapes. The Emerald Necklace in Boston is a series of interconnected landscapes connected by carriage drives and connected by a waterway, very much like Scajaquada Creek, and paths along the waterway and a restored waterway. So why couldn't we do something like that here in Buffalo and have Buffalo's own version? So, which is the reason that I refer to this as not the Emerald Necklace from Boston, but Buffalo's Emerald Crescent, because really all these landscapes are laid out in the shape of a crescent. So if you're looking for an overall theme for remaking the Scajaquada corridor, this is what I believe it should be. And one of the implications is, since this is a cultural landscape, we need to get a cultural landscape report done. Buffalo is familiar with cultural landscape reports. One was done for the Richardson complex, which laid the groundwork for the planning there that was compatible with the Olmsted and Richardson heritage. Another key resource in looking at the corridor is Frank Kowski's most excellent book on the Olmsted Park system. It's essential. If you don't have a copy, you ought to get a copy if you want to be informed about what we're doing with the Scajaquada corridor. A month ago, the region central planning process released a preferred scenario, which you may have seen. The basic gist of it is keeping a 2-lane parkway that runs through the entire corridor. And that concept is compatible also with the research and planning that I did. One of the things to note is the concept of disconnecting the Scajaquada corridor from the 33 on the eastern end, which is a fascinating concept and creates some very interesting possibilities. But the question is that if this is your backbone, what the creature looks like is not just the backbone, but the sinew and the meat and the flesh on the bones. So how do we put the flesh on the bones in a way that's the most consistent with the Olmsted heritage of the corridor? There was a study for the 33 project that I was invited to be involved in 10 years ago that was done by the UB School of Architecture and Planning. So there's currently work underway on the 33 with the idea of putting a deck over the Kensington Expressway. This will be separate from my discussion, but I'm mentioning it to indicate that this is a completely separate process that in the alphabet soup of things is being overseen by the DOT, not GBNRTC. We're not sure that the DOT is doing the best job on this, but we're trying to be as engaged as possible to make that the best kind of project that it can be as well. So I'm going to go from east to west on the corridor, starting with the Humboldt Parkway section on the eastern end. And if you look at this, this section of the Scajaquada corridor that used to be part of Humboldt Parkway, it forms a sort of almost on-ramp to the 33. If you're trying to get to the 33 from North Buffalo or the west side or the Elmwood Village, you have to go through this area where you have a park on the north and the cemetery on the south. There's one way through to get to the 33. So what that means is there's lots and lots of traffic on the eastern end. These are the traffic volumes from 2017. They've dropped a lot with the pandemic and work from home, but it gives you an idea of the scale of the traffic on the eastern end. So could you restore the eastern end to the original Humboldt Parkway? Well, it's not clear that you could do that with the amount of traffic that's on it, but there are other options that are referred to as capping and stitching in projects that are being done around the country to remake urban expressways. So those might be a possibility that you could look at for the eastern end. And then you get to Main Street, you have a host of problems at Main Street, including the fact that the access point for Metro Rail is south of the intersection, and there is no access to Metro Rail on the north side of the intersection, which leaves Sisters Hospital kind of high and dry. Sisters Hospital also has a very unappealing building built right on the corner. The other problem with the Main Street area is that the Kensington Avenue comes in at an odd angle, and it creates a lot of very challenging traffic movements, pedestrian movements, bicycle movements. So what could you do there? Well, you could create a circle, because circles take streets that come in from odd angles and they help to normalize the traffic. But circles that are Baroque circles, like you would find in Paris, Washington, D.C., Niagara Square in downtown Buffalo, have all the traffic movements on the outside edge, which means that they take up a lot of land. So if you wanted to do a circle there, how could you do that? Well, this gives an idea. This is crayon level design work, but it gives an idea how much land you would have to take up if you wanted to do a full circle there. Well, that's problematic because it involves taking property. But if you look at the difference between a Baroque circle and the circles that Olmsted and Vaux created, which come from the landscape architecture tradition, there's much more landscape in the Olmsted circles, and the traffic movements are toward the center. So perhaps you could do something in phases, where you start with a small circle that handles the traffic movements in the center, perhaps on a deck over the road, so that the high volume traffic goes underneath and doesn't congest the intersection. But then maybe do this in phases and also incorporate some redevelopment. On the eastern side, you could do some mixed use, low income housing that would also create some retail opportunities facing the street. On the western side, you could do some redevelopment at Sisters Hospital, where you could actually give them more space than they have now. And you could, this just shows a configuration with sort of a low-rise building with some towers on top and some open space and cafes on top of the low-rise building, and even a running track. And then what you also get is you get some retail space along Main Street instead of a sea of parking to pass when you pass by Sisters Hospital. Then, if you wanted to fully flesh out the circle, you could reconfigure some of the housing on the north side. But the point being, if you wanted to do this in phases, you could do it in phases and it would still work. And you wouldn't necessarily have to do all four quadrants in order to have a working traffic mechanism and still good landscape. But you could expand it over time. You can imagine creating a Main Street redevelopment corporation that could work with private property owners and Sisters Hospital to do this work over time. And then you'd have an Olmstedian circle on an Olmstedian corridor. As you get further away, you get to Agassiz Circle. Agassiz Circle, you start making a transition because you get much lower traffic volumes west of Agassiz Circle, and you also get into this area where the maintenance buildings are. And the maintenance buildings present a challenge, but also an opportunity. Maybe those maintenance buildings could be redeveloped into park amenities and have a much nicer appearance, and also provide the kind of amenities that you wouldn't get in the rest of the park. Then you get to the meadow section. Here's the area where poor Maxim Sugorovsky was hit by a car in 2015. And which was, the impetus for the lowering of the speed limit and for the state to get serious about converting this corridor from an expressway into something that's more park compatible. But the DOT didn't seem to know how to do that. The DOT seemed more interested in just shaping up the existing expressway, making it more park-like, and calling it a day. As I said here, putting lipstick on a pig. But this is not the kind of thing that Olmsted and Vaux did in their parks. Olmsted and Vaux, where they had to have roads, city roads running through a park, they did a transverse road system. This is one of the reasons they won the design competition to create Central Park. And the transverse roads are sunken and they're out of the way of park users. Now, there are ways to do that, to screen a road from a park without necessarily having to dig it into the form of a trench. And here are some examples from the parks in Boston, where that's done with vegetation, with terrain, with stone walls. So there are ways to screen a road from the park meadow instead of just having a surface road that could become even larger if you try to turn it into a parkway with a median. As you continue west on the Scajaquada corridor, you get to Forest Lawn, which was also part of the scope of the Region Central study. But with recent leadership turmoil at Forest Lawn, there hasn't been a lot of participation. So there currently aren't concepts on the table for Forest Lawn. But I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And here is a friendly ghost that I ran into at Forest Lawn. Forest Lawn is a very important heritage landscape. It also has some of the most picturesque landscape in the city of Buffalo. It has one of only 2 waterfalls in the city of Buffalo, but the waterfall is actually not accessible. There's no trail to it. So if you don't know that it's there, you may have never actually seen it. Also, Forest Lawn has a fence all the way around it, and there aren't even sidewalks if you wanted to walk around and even just view the scenery through the fence. So what could be done? Well, it could be possible that you could create a continuous path through Forest Lawn along Scajaquada Creek. You could also put a pathway with sidewalks around the perimeter and maybe creating some new access points in the fence at Forest Lawn. That way people could have more access to Forest Lawn to see some of that picturesque landscape. Most of the picturesque landscape in Forest Lawn is along Scajaquada Creek. So maybe you could even create some kind of a blue line within the cemetery where you would manage some of this land along the creek for footpaths and more scenic access. Also, you could also create a nice circle at Delaware and Delavan at the entrance to Forest Lawn. Then as you continue to move west, you get to Delaware Avenue, which creates a very interesting set of problems because currently the expressway goes over the bridge and everyone would like to see the expressway removed from the bridge and the bridge returned just to park users. But then if you're keeping a continuous road, what do you then do with the road if it's not going over the bridge? There have been various things proposed. 5 years ago, the Scajaquada Corridor Coalition, which works with several organizations, including the Olmsted Conservancy, Waterkeeper, Go Bike Buffalo, proposed a kind of land bridge approach, but that also creates a large intersection in the middle of the park. And so how is that compatible? How could you screen that from park users? So there's lots of design work still that needs to be done and plenty of room for creative approaches. As you go further west to the Hoyt Lake section, well, the Hoyt Lake section, as you can see, is very narrow. Olmsted wanted this area to be larger, but the city wouldn't buy enough property. So there's this very narrow corridor. And so what do you do? Again, if you use the transverse road model of hiding the road from the park, that might be the way to go in that area. Then as you get a little further west, you come to the Lincoln Parkway section of Delaware Park. And the idea that advocates have in the Scajaquada Corridor Coalition and Region Central is to reuse Lincoln Parkway and also Iroquois Drive, rather than having a separate roadway. And for an example of how that might look, one of my fellow writers at Buffalo Rising, David Steele, is an architect, and he did a drawing showing how that would work. And you can see reusing a Lincoln Parkway and Iroquois Drive. David Steele also showed returning Elmwood Avenue to its original alignment, which used to go straight north-south. When the expressway was built, Elmwood Avenue was moved and it was put on an embankment, which took away literally acres from the creek and from the creek bank. And if you returned Elmwood to its original alignment, you could get some of that land back and also do some creek restoration. And so if you continue west, you're in the cultural district. One of the things you could do in the cultural district, again, this is very crayon level design, but you could put part of Iroquois Drive underneath a terrace, and then you could extend the land. And this was done before the site was selected for the museum expansion, but you could still do a project like this where you could extend the area around the gallery to the north a bit and have an area for displaying public art and also overseeing the creek. One of the things about the cultural district is the Rhinestein Center, which is an old house that's on the grounds of the Buffalo Museum of Science that you may never even have seen, even if you've been to the Buffalo Museum of Science. Was originally waterfront property. If you returned Elmwood to its original alignment, which you can see here, the Rhinestein Center would become waterfront once again, and perhaps it could be a boathouse. and even, you know, a visitor center or some kind of an ecological center with exhibits about Scajaquada Creek and cleaning up Scajaquada Creek. And again, that's what the Rhinestein Center looks like. It's invisible much of the year when the foliage is on the trees because it's screened by the highway or by the Elmwood Avenue embankment. So as you continue west, you get to an area where you have much more street grid than you do on the eastern end of the Scajaquada corridor. So now, if you're removing the expressway, you can use some of this street grid to absorb some of that traffic into the community. One area that you can do that is where Nottingham Terrace is extended to the west of Elmwood, currently as an on-off ramp. If you keep that connection in place, even though you're making the Scajaquada corridor a parkway, perhaps using Iroquois Drive, if you keep Nottingham Terrace connected, then that's an important east-west part of the street grid. And then you talk about, well, what do we actually do with the creek at that point? Because the other thing that transitions at that point is the creek and the expressway are no longer separate, but they're side by side. So now what you do with the expressway affects the creek and vice versa. So as you're redoing the expressway, it's also an exciting opportunity to remake the creek. And that's largely what Olmsted did in the Emerald Necklace in Boston. This picture is an example of the muddy river that was ecologically restored with plantings, and it became an important scenic and recreational corridor from the polluted waterway that it once had been. So why couldn't we create something like this when we redo the Scajaquada corridor? And if you look at the Back Bay Fens, which is a famous part of the Emerald Necklace that was created along the Muddy River, Olmsted did this as an early sort of green infrastructure project. And if you notice, the Scajaquada Fens is actually not much bigger than the section of Scajaquada Creek next to Buffalo State. And it's not much wider. So maybe we could do something like this near Buffalo State or west of Elmwood Avenue. So there's lots of good reasons to do that. And this is the kind of scenic landscape that you have there. Wouldn't something like this be nice to have west of Elmwood or adjacent to Buffalo State for the students, you know, to go let off some steam or take a run? If you look to the north, you also get to the Black Rock, Grant Amherst business district, and there could be an opportunity to also bolster that by taking some of the resources on the north side of the creek and sort of connecting them in a placemaking kind of way. And I've used the term Black Rock Landing as sort of a shorthand to refer to that concept. But a central part of it would be a pedestrian bridge that would connect the business district with Buffalo State. And also this building that's one of the most historic buildings along the Scajaquada corridor that's currently in jeopardy. So any preservationists out there, help. And that's called the Buffalo Robe Company. And that's one of the major landmarks along the creek. This is a crayonish concept for what you could do at Wegmans. Maybe if you put the parking underground and did mixed use development on the parking lots there, sort of a Wegmans village. Then you could create a terrace for overlooking the creek, which could be a beloved event space. And then you were getting to the very western end and the stopping point. But what you notice about the western end of the creek is the western end of the creek used to be much, much bigger. And it turns out the research I've done showed that this was a canal harbor on the western end of the creek that was connected to the Black Rock Harbor and to the Erie Canal. And in fact, if you look in 1866, before the park system was created, it was ringed with industry. And these industries all used the canal to bring in materials and take out finished goods. So the reason that water body was not incorporated into the park is that it was already industrial before the park was created. And what happened is, as water transportation was no longer important and everything went to rail, then all of that land was filled in a very short period of time, as you can see from these diagrams over the years. And then it gets to this sort of trickle of water that currently runs through there now. And in fact, there was so much industry on the western end of the creek that in this picture, when the expressway was being built, you can hardly even tell where the creek was. The other important thing at the western end of the creek is archaeology. That was the site of the Battle of Scajaquada Creek Bridge. And it also apparently was the site where some of the ships were outfitted for Commodore Perry's fleet that won the Battle of Lake Erie. So there are some very important historic aspects to the landscape on the western end of the creek, and there may be some archaeological finds there that we could make. If you wanted to preserve the western end of the creek and preserve it, then you have to do some land use planning, and which basically amounts to drawing lines on a map. And the first line you might draw is a circle around the original footprint of the creek to say, well, let's not build anything there because we might have some archaeology and we might want to restore some of this someday. And then a green buffer around that. And then if you look at what happens when you remove the horrible viaduct from the creek and you have a surface parkway, where would that surface parkway go? This is some work that was done by landscape architecture students from SUNY ESF, and they showed a scenic parkway that skirts around the south side of the creek and then connects to the Niagara-Tonawanda Street intersection. To me, that seems like the right way to go. That roadway or that parkway could also serve a land use function like the roadways in the Emerald Necklace in Boston, because what you generally have is you have city and neighborhood on one side, then you have the parkway, then you usually have a multi-use path, and you have green space, then a footpath along the water body, and then the water body. So the roadway itself actually serves a land use protective function, because on one side of the road, you're not going to build things. You're just going to have park, and you're going to have ecology and landscape and recreational space. So if you took that new landscape and grafted it on to the original Olmsted corridor, then what you see is the opportunity to use the remake of the 198 to essentially extend Delaware Park west all the way to the Niagara River. And wouldn't that be exciting? And then you can compare it to the Emerald Necklace at the bottom. And again, back to the Region Central scenario that was shown last month, the preferred scenario. All these visions are really compatible with this preferred scenario, which again could serve as a backbone. But how we put the sinew and the flesh and the muscle on the skeleton depends on is what's going to determine the success of this project. So let's make this a successful project. This is another example on the western end where you could actually keep the Scajaquada corridor connected to the 190. It might be possible, maybe not. And then you would also want to reconnect Bradley Street, which would give you another way into the Richardson-Olmsted complex. And then that takes Buffalo State from this and gives you actually a waterfront campus. Buffalo State has an arboretum that has fallen on hard times in the decade since it was created, but folks are working on recreating that. So lots of potential for nature and landscape and trees at Buffalo State. And then if you did this project and you also in the future converted the 190 to downgraded that to a boulevard, then that could give you a parkway connection to Riverside Park that people have been trying to create ever since Riverside Park was created. and the 190 was created in the former towpath of the Erie Canal. And when that happened, the residents of the community actually held a funeral for the towpath, which they had formerly used as sort of a recreational corridor and for water access. You could also do mobility with a transit system along the corridor. Currently, all the bus routes go across the corridor, but none of the bus routes connect the great institutions and destinations along the corridor themselves. So let's look at doing that. You could create parkway connections once you upgrade the corridor, and even a green space network on the east and west end. These are some of the articles that I wrote for Buffalo Rising, and thank you for your attention.
Alan, that's a great presentation. You did what I hoped would happen, and that's condense your thoughts into our time period. Well done. Quick question, and folks, if you have some questions, we'll run over a little bit. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but put them into the chat room, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Alan, given the years of study that have gone on, how do you keep this from just dragging on and on when there were several options and preferred options given and expressed by the GBNRTC? I know this now lands with the DOT, Department of Transportation in New York State, but you know, how do you keep this from just being talked about and moved into action? Because you've certainly opened our eyes and have been doing this for a long time to a great many possibilities that maybe should be staged in, and we begin with something. Is that a possibility?
Well, yes, and Dennis, when you say eventually this will be turned over to the DOT, you know, that almost makes my hair stand on end, because they don't have the greatest track record. But that's exactly what will eventually happen, because the DOT builds the roads. The planners don't build the roads. The planners don't own the bulldozers. So what we need to do, and what we've discussed in the Scajaquada Corridor Coalition, including in a meeting last week, with some architects at the table, is saying, now that we have the basic concept on the table, as I've discussed, the success or failure of this project really comes down to design. And one of the things about the Region Central process is, unlike the way the DOT works, the Region Central planning process has been much more open. So it's been much easier for citizens to get a seat at the table and to get the attention of the planners. So I think what that means is that the time is right now to start putting our concepts on the table and to start doing additional planning and conceptual work, even if those of us in the community have to do it ourselves, or have to maybe, you know, go to a foundation and say, you know, can you give us some resources so that we can get some conceptual work done, so that we can show people in the community, for this part of the corridor, we could do this. For this part of the corridor, we could do this, and start getting people on board and start getting people lined up, so that when the DOT gets involved, we're not going to accept anything less than the best.
Good. Melissa, any questions that we can fairly quickly address?
We don't have any questions at this time.
And this has been a good dialogue. I will thank you, Alan, for helping us imagine Greater Buffalo, the very name of this series for the last 13 years or so. In a creative way. It was Olmsted that took our original design, created the first park system in America, called it the best planned city as to its parks, spaces and green spaces in America, and maybe the world. And it's our generation's time to restore that those original bones of Buffalo, if you will, what made it such a beautiful city and still has the potential for doing so. Part of it is transportation, obviously, in those parkways. And this is the moment where everybody has the attention of the money that is being allocated towards doing something, whether it's the 198 or very quickly the 33. What you've done is try to incorporate the two of them so that we see them as a system. Others are saying the same thing. The Olmsted Parks Conservancy, the Buffalo Niagara Waterkeepers, interested groups. So folks, use this YouTube link that you'll have from the library, share it with friends, help being part of the ongoing discussion, and let's see what our generation can help restore to the beauty that was Buffalo and certainly is. We just have to kind of rearrange it a little bit. So Alan,
I would say amen to all of that.
Alan, thank you very much. Folks, join us next week. Dr. Eva Doyle will be speaking. Her years of chronicling the east side and all sides of Buffalo will be for our listening and viewing pleasure next Tuesday. So thank you for joining us today. See you next week. I'm Dennis Galucki. Be well and good day.
Okay, we did it.